As I reached into my pocket just now to take off my name tag, which needs to be returned, I think, right? The little plastic things need to be returned by the end. As I reached into my pocket to get the name tag out, I found the ultimate significance of time written on the fortune cookie fortune that I got last night when our group got together for our meal. It reads, "As you advance in life, you learn the limits of abilities." And I feel that I'm up against the limits of abilities here this afternoon in trying to bring this conference to a conclusion that will be worthy of the conference and at the same time communicate to people who are here for the public lecture and who have not been attending the conference. My assignment, as David and I worked it out in advance, was to reflect on the conference and to try to draw into my concluding lecture some of the highlights of the conference as a kind of a report to the people who have not been with us, and as a kind of a personal reflection for those who have been sitting and talking and arguing and having such a good time as have most of you here, you faithful survivors who are still on the scene. This is a difficult thing to do, of course, and I hope you'll bear with me and recognize the limitations that I recognize of not only my abilities, but of the capacity of the human mind to deal with the significance of time for truth, goodness, and the sacred. What a topic I bit off. I don't know how David let me do it. The significance of time for truth, goodness, and the sacred. These issues are, each one of them, infinite, and I can't resist telling one more Nels Ferré story. My father was a Swede and always loved to poke fun at Swedes, and there's nothing he liked better than jokes about Swedes. He had one joke that's apropos of this occasion. There was a Swedish sailor who was coiling rope that he was bringing up from the ocean, and as he hauled it up and coiled it, he hauled it up and coiled it, and hauled it up and coiled it, and the coil grew larger and larger, and he kept on hauling and kept on coiling, and eventually he stopped, wiped his brow, and said, "Payum penyimini, the end must be cut off." And that's the case with these issues. For all of them, the end is cut off. The first issue having to do with the significance of time for truth. I think we all in our bones recognize the extent to which every truth, or should I say, every approximation of truth that we human beings can acquire seems to fall victim to time. And this is one of the important issues that we need to probe, and in fact that we did probe to some extent, not enough, but to some extent in our conference. The way in which our available concepts, the formalisms of our language, of our models, of our theories, all of these are time-dependent and changing with the process of time. And so is the available evidence as well. That is a matter of interaction with those concepts that are constantly struggling to be adequate to the evidence as it comes to us. And so, as we think first about the ultimate significance of time for truth, it's worthwhile, I think, just reflecting for a little bit on the problem of formalisms in general. By formalisms, I'm talking about that whole concatenation of language and models and images and metaphors, theories and formulae, every kind of way in which we human beings attempt to capture in some way that can last more than a moment the thoughts that we have, the experiences that we have, and capture them in such a way that they can be put together and make sense of the flux of our experience. Now, it's certain that formalisms of one kind or another are desperately needed, are essential for human beings. They are, I suspect, a necessary condition for being adequately explicit about our experience and about our thought. And yet at the same time, we realize that formalisms, no matter how hard we work to make them adequate, are always to some extent inadequate to the full depth and height of our experience. It's, of course, the case that there are better and worse formalisms. And with regard to theory of time, which has been the main item on our agenda, there have indeed been many worse and many better formalisms in the recent history of thought about time. And Milich Čapek yesterday spoke to us about the history of the idea of time and the better and worse formalisms that have dominated the debate over time in the Western tradition. Most recently, as Dr. Čapek pointed out yesterday, we have had a formalism that has been very much based upon certain needs of mathematics and certain representations that have had to do with the four-dimensionality of space-time that has come into currency since the Great Revolution, the Einsteinian revolution of relativistic theory. And while I won't try to take the time to repeat some of the things that Dr. Čapek said yesterday, it certainly is the case that the insistence on some of those formalisms gave to the thinking about time in our recent history a kind of split from the experienced time that has multiplied problems. Adolf Grünbaum, a primary exponent of interpreting the formalisms of mathematics and of a certain kind of mathematics, a limited form of mathematics, I hasten to say, and of relativistic Minkowskian diagrams, giving these formalisms a kind of absoluteness, a kind of literal interpretation. Adolf Grünbaum insisted that even though he personally acknowledged that time came to us episodically, that we experience time in, as it were, units that are fundamentally indivisible, droplets of experience, you might say. He to that extent agreed with Whitehead, and with Bergson, well, with Whitehead at least, in the experience of time as epochal. Nonetheless, Grünbaum, while accepting that phenomenological account of our human experience, insisted that because the mathematics that we need to deal with time has a property known as denseness, that is, that between every point there must be, in theory, admitted another, between every 2 points, there must in theory be admitted another point ad infinitum, that because mathematics of time required this property, that therefore real time had to have that property, and therefore that our experienced time was radically discontinuous with the theoretical time that could be dealt with by mathematics. If he had to choose between, in other words, experience on the one hand of our temporal flow and the requirements of that certain formalism of mathematics, he chose the formalism of mathematics and let the experience fend for itself. In the same way, he argued, this is still Grünbaum, that the four-dimensional depiction of space-time required that all events in the universe, though not all simultaneous, he insisted that, of course, at any given clock time, at any given indication of a calendar and a watch, that there was only a limited number of events that were contemporary with that, and even then contemporary only in a rough and ready way because of relativistic theory. But nonetheless, that at every clock time conceivable in the universe, both past and future, they're correlated with it a set of events that were in a, this is Grunbaum's expression, a tenseless sense of were, if you can believe that. Sorry, I'm showing my skepticism, am I not? In a tenseless sense of existence, that those events exist along with the clock times, so that the universe is a four-dimensional plenum full of all the events of the universe, and no other events could be than the ones that in a timeless sense already are. Now that again was something that he interpreted as being required by the formalism of the depiction of the space-time theories taken from the Einsteinian revolution. Now, as I say, it seems to me that there are better and there are worse formalisms, and I'm happy to report that at this conference we have been hearing better formalisms, and this is something that I have taken great comfort from. Major scientific breakthroughs have been being achieved in recent years, and Professor Prigogine, who will be speaking to you a little later, is one who has come to us and told us about the breakthroughs that he has presided over and the new formalisms that he has been developing that allow us to recognize genuine becoming in the universe. Formalisms in the terms of equations, in terms of other depictions, through which it can be indicated that there is genuine transience and that is irreversible and that is incompressible. And so, from these alternative formalisms, our own intuitive experience, the experience of becoming that human beings have, can be better interpreted and related to the full scientific corpus. This is good news. There's better as well as worse formalisms. We don't have to choose, perhaps, between our experience as human beings on the one hand and what the scientists are working with on the other. And Professor Bohm, who has been with us and whom you have heard on another public occasion, indeed yesterday, as one of the commentators, also offers us fascinating new formalisms within which the universe enfolds and unfolds and is capable within his formalisms of actually constituting a meaningful whole. The concept of the universe as having meaning is implicit, is not even implicit, is explicit within David Bohm's new formalisms, and they too, I think, for those of us who are interested in the integration of all experience and life within a adequate theoretical framework, they give us encouragement too. At the same time, I think it's important that we recognize the inbuilt difficulties of becoming too attached to any formalisms. That even when formalisms are ones that we welcome, even when we are excited and indeed thrilled with enthusiasm about the new possibilities that these open for us, that we recognize our finite human situation within the total theoretical situation in which the touchstone of formalisms is always required to be something that is larger than, that must be interpreted through, but that never is entirely encapsulated in even our best formalisms. I think that this is an important point. We discussed during the conference the relationship between science and metaphysics. And if I may simply return to a couple of comments that were made, one of our distinguished members made the assertion that science sets the context within which one asks the metaphysical question. I would add that in addition, philosophy, as Whitehead pointed out, is also and always the critic of every abstraction. So it is not only that science sets the context and philosophy works within that context, but also philosophy must, if it's to be true to its proper function, return to a critical examination of the very context that was offered to it. And in this context itself, it's interesting to notice the extent to which Whitehead turned beyond the sciences for his raw material in dealing with what was significant for examining the conceptualities and formalisms available to us, and turned to the poets, to Wordsworth, to Shelley, to give as a group of people who try to deal as much as possible with those filled formalisms that are as close as possible to the intuitions of human experience, the poet, an opportunity to criticize the abstractions that had arisen in the 17th century and that came to fullest flower, perhaps, in the high and somewhat abstract formalisms of the Grunbaums that I've mentioned before. So, the goal of philosophy, or the goal, should I say, of people thinking together, whether philosophers or scientists, should perhaps be understood dialectically as a constant movement back and forth between, on the one hand, the development of the better formalism and the still better formalism through the criticism of formalisms by bringing them to bear again on the fundamental deliverances of human experience. If, as Whitehead said, and he was quoted at our conference by one member from the Modes of Thought as saying the goal of philosophy is sheer disclosure, that doesn't mean we can do without the formalisms that help us in these disclosures, but it means that disclosure must somehow itself go beyond the formalism to find its root again in experience. As David Bohm said at another point in our conference, we need an act of attention that goes beyond thought. Pardon the sound effects. Let me turn to the second of my topics, time and goodness, because it's when we come to the question of goodness, in fact, that one of the grave inadequacies of the older, inadequate formalism of time as a four-dimensional, as time as one of the four dimensions of a continuous plenum of space-time, is really manifest. Think about a universe, think seriously in terms of the moral implications of a universe in which every event, every possible event in the universe was already is a temporal word. I mustn't use it. Grunbaum would be angry. Sorry. That every event of the universe has, in a timeless sense of has, its own clock time already attached to it and is fully real in a non-temporal sense of is, fully real at its own clock time. All right? Think about the universe of that sort. It has been informally and polemically called the block universe. But it's a not bad polemic, because the block image, that four-dimensional plenum continuum, right, in which every event has its designated locus, is one in which there is no real becoming, one in which there is no genuine change, one in which nothing could be other than it is to be, right? What will be, que sera, sera. And in this universe, if there's one thing that's sure, I think, one thing that I would really fight for as a philosopher, it is that there could be no moral growth, no moral significance to human agents in such a universe in which every event, including every personal decision, every personal act, would be already timelessly there, somehow fixed and without the possibility of any alteration. In fact, I'd like to meditate with you for just a moment on space and time as moral categories. If we're talking about the ultimate significance of time, we should think of the ultimate significance in terms of what this means for morality. If you were inventing a universe, if you were God, who had a high regard for personal, creative development, what would you do? What would you insert into the universe you were going to create to make genuine personal growth and the possibility of loving fellowship, perhaps, of creative mutuality between genuine persons possible? One thing you would have to put into such a universe, and maybe it's the ultimate significance of it, is an opportunity for creative response, for dialogue, for a give and take between agents who were learning to deal with each other in a creative and constantly improving way, to learn from mistakes, to make mistakes and regret them and make them up and make other mistakes and learn to regret them and so on, and maybe make fewer mistakes, but at least the possibility of there being growth in responsibility and in concern requires, I'm not talking about this in a frivolous way, I'm talking about game playing in a very serious way in which people are in dialogue with each other, passing the initiative, the moral initiative, back and forth. Without such an ingredient of the possibility of there being a genuine response to a genuine offer, there could be no mutuality, no growth, no personal fulfillment. And if that's so, that's time. That is, time is the necessary condition. Time, looked at this way, is the possibility for creative personal response, and therefore the logical condition, the necessary condition for there being a growth in fellowship among centers of responsible agency, learning fellowship in freedom. But the other thing that's necessary, if there is to be such fellowship in freedom, such genuineness of personal agency, is also the possibility of these agents being significantly selves. Not isolated, not cut off, as David Bohm continually has been reminding us, the self itself is a murky, ambiguous concept, and it is. There is no clear boundary between the self and the rest of the universe. But there must at least be the possibility of there being some focus of some locality, even though smudged and blended at the edges, some locality at which focus there can be a significant responsibility, a significant acceptance of agency, which is not for the sake of its own monadic privatehood, but rather for the sake of learning how to respond to the other in a way that creates the conditions for fellowship. And that's space. Space is the logical prerequisite for there to be a mutual relative simultaneity of personal agency, at the same time that time is the condition for extensive growth over a period of learning. So space and time have profound moral significance and are necessary conditions for mutually becoming of personal otherness and creative fellowship. Which leads me to the final point, the question of the sacred. The sacred, as I wish to talk about it, would be that which is the focus of final value, that which is worthy of worship. I'll spit it right out, God. But what do we make about God? What do we mean when we're talking about time and God? I'd like to speculate. Give me the freedom to speculate a little about God in terms of what I've said about truth and goodness. It seems to me that if, in fact, God is conceived as love, if God is conceived as the primary everlasting fellowship, the creative ground of others' creative growth into fellowship, then it would seem to me that it makes a certain amount of sense to talk about God Himself as constituting everlasting fellowship within His Godhead, within her Godhead, within its Godhead, within their Godhead. Let's settle on that, within their Godhead. I don't mean to sound tritheistic or multi-polytheistic, but why not try on a different terminological confusion just to help us get out of the older terminological confusions? There was a great insight, I think, into the Trinitarian formulation, although I'm not hooked on threes. Maybe there were more than three. When the Christian fathers insisted that God is both one and many, and that within the Godhood themselves there is a personal interaction. Now, this question came up yesterday. You remember in the discussion period, we started to talk about the Trinitarian formula. We started to talk about the persons of the traditional Trinitarian God and the processions and all of those things. I shan't get technical. But it seems to me that if the earlier point I made is in fact correct, that time is, or some analog of time, something that involves the possibility of becoming, that this is a logical necessity, a prerequisite for there to be creative, loving, personal interaction, then we must conclude that there is something like becoming in God. That there is, if you like, there has been for a long time recognized the analogy of being. Why not recognize for God the analogy of becoming? And why not just say becoming, in fact? As long as we recognize that by the concept of becoming, we are not trying to reduce the concept to our own particular kind of becoming, the sort of becoming that is characteristic of our evolved species within our space-time framework, but something that will allow the genuine creative interaction of the persons that constitute the ultimate source of creative personhood in the universe to have the loving interaction that constitutes in God the model and ground of the very sort of fellowship into which the world of space and time allows us also to emerge. Now, at the same time, there is another profound intuition that is important that we do not ignore. If I talk about the analogy of becoming in God, I want also at the same time to talk about the analogy of being. I don't want to say that in the end we lose sight of being because we are recognizing the essential becomingness within the loving Godhead. It's hard to know just what conceptuality can do the trick for this. And I must say that one of the very best modes of conceptuality that I know in dealing with the need to deal honestly and fairly with both these intuitions, both the intuition that somehow love requires becoming, and also the intuition that the last word cannot be the realm of insecurity and decay that is also implicit in our ordinary sense of time, time's tooth, that I referred to in a comment of mine in the conference. The best conceptuality that I know in this is, in fact, the Whiteheadian conceptuality that we heard John Cobb deal with in the course of the conference, and I will not try to state again what he did, but there are a number of different dimensions or a number of different ways in which the recognition of the eternal can be incorporated within the theological structures if we recognize that, for example, the small interval of becoming that is part of the epochal character of our own experience of time itself, when brought down to its minimum part, to its fundamental quantum, is not a matter of temporality. Somehow escapes when you, as John Cobb said, when you slice temporality thin enough, it stops being temporality. And it's becoming that is somehow no longer merely a matter under the categories of temporality. If we can see that, we can recognize perhaps the root of the intuition that is important in much mystical experience of the getting beyond the temporal by going deep within one's own experience. And if one can recognize also the dimension of the eternal forms of things, the realm of eternal objects in the primordial nature of God, to use the Whiteheadian language, as also constituting something that is not in flux, we find the ground for another dimension of responding to this fundamental, deep, and real intuition that many of mankind's history and contemporaries recognize. I don't know what the conceptuality is that will turn out to be the very best, but this much let me close with, that if we began by recognizing the historical conditionedness of all formalisms, we should also recognize that this holds equally well for theological formalisms as well as for scientific formalisms. That the formalisms that we work for are, in the end, in need of being open to every dimension of input. They need, on the one hand, to be open, these theological formulations, to be open to the scientific formulations that come to us with the most refined and careful attention to both experience of limited sorts and also to the demands of theoretical consistency and adequacy. The sciences must be incorporated into the responsible theological formalisms as we move. In addition, theological formalisms need to be deeply open to those intuitions into the heart of things that religious mystics and ordinary people have always insisted we must respond to. And in the end, our formalisms, our theories, none of them are sacred. Only perhaps the everlasting quest to use our time and fill it for the enlargement of goodness under the discipline of truth. Thank you.